Welcome to the Siwike podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The Siwike podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Siwike Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here with one of our new guest hosts, Dylan Nadler, who comes to us with a background in Taekwondo and psychology. And we thought we'd have a discussion about him and his background. So Dylan, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
Fantastic as always. So, Dylan, I'd love if you were able to share with the audience, what are you up to these days? What are you doing now? And then we'll kind of rewind the clock and talk about you kind of growing up as a kid. So, Dylan, what are you up to these days?
Yeah, so I'm the founder of a company called MindLock, which is mental training for athletes. So what that means is pretty much developing the mental skills and strategies that are so crucial for performance success. In sports and non-sports, honestly, whether you're an athlete or not. But it's developing kind of the behind-the-scenes skill set and toolkit kind of required for that performance success. So things like confidence, motivation, goal setting, imagery, self-talk, identity, right? Like all of the kind of behind-the-scenes factors that are so important and so crucial when it comes to performance success, but the things that athletes don't necessarily prioritize just because there's not a lot of information around it, right? There's a lot of physical preparation, there's a lot of cardio and strength and conditioning and technical and diet and stuff like that, but when you ask someone how much of performance is mental, the answer is a lot. But then when you ask, well, what are you doing about that? Not so much. So that's where we kind of fill in the gap at MindLock, which is to really equip athletes with the mental tools that they need to perform well. And, that's what I do as the founder.
That's amazing, and I think that's so much needed because if you think about top performing athletes, like a lot of the physicality is pretty similar, where the strength and the speed and all of that is fairly similar, but it's often that mental game, that dedication, commitment, as you said, can be such a differentiating factor. So, but I love before we kind of dive a little bit more into that is to rewind and go back in time and talk about Dylan growing up. So what was Dylan like as a kid? How did he get to this point? What is maybe one of the earliest childhood memories that you might have?
Yeah, I was always a very athletic kid. My parents put me in Taekwondo when I was 5. I played house league soccer for all of elementary school. I was on the school teams, and just very much so. I just loved being active. I think I can remember even preschool days. I think there was a sport ball or something like that. It was a different after school thing, and I did that. I always liked to kind of be active, and I was pretty good at it, whichever kind of sport that I did, and that definitely influenced my interest later on. I wasn't a big school person. I wasn't a big I hung out with my friends a lot, but for me it was mostly just about sports and being competitive. Even until now, my whole life, is as long as I can remember, I've always been extremely competitive in anything that I do. So it kind of makes sense that being an athlete was the avenue that I chose. But yeah, kind of what you were saying, from an early age, just kind of committing myself to whatever it was that I did. Most of the time that was sports, and seeing how that progressed kind of later and later on.
Sounds good. And what were some of the influences along the way? Were a lot of your family members, brothers, sisters, cousins, that sort of thing, were they pretty athletic, or were you kind of the black sheep where everybody was book smart and studious and you were the sporty one? Or what were some of the influences around you growing up?
Yeah, my parents were both athletic when they were younger, and I think my dad had done Taekwondo for a little bit, but not competitively. I think he was a big volleyball player and skier. He was always an athlete, and same thing with my mom. She was always into fitness and stuff like that. And me and my brother kind of had a lot of natural talents, just in terms of being fast and being pretty strong for our ages at the time and stuff like that. So it kind of, we were an athletic family. We'd go to the park as little kids, and we'd bring a backpack with a football and a baseball and a soccer ball, and we would just be there for hours, just mixing it up with different sports. So I guess tactile wise and technically we kind of developed a skill set for playing sports early on. That's just because we did. But in terms of eliteness, I think I was the only one from anyone that I know that really took sport to the level that I did and stuck with it that long.
Yeah, and I love if you talk a little bit about where, or if you have a sense of where that commitment came from, right? Is that just something kind of natural, or was it groomed over time, or it was the love of the sport, or some other aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had a pretty like obsessive personality. So if I find something that I like and I'm good at, like it's a wrap at that point. Like I'm gonna stick with it. And I've always been very intense. So even like I was saying with like house league soccer, I mean, house league soccer doesn't matter. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, but I was treating like every game like it was the World Cup. Like for me, like I was just committed. And like I said, if I was good at something and I enjoyed it, you couldn't separate me from it. So when it came to having to make the commitment to choosing Taekwondo, was at a point where I transitioned from a more recreational gym to a high performance one, and with that came more of a commitment. So I had to be training more days a week. I couldn't play the other sports I wanted to. I had to drop out of soccer and not go and try out for school teams. So it was a natural progression of, all right, I'm deciding I'm committing to this. I have big goals and big dreams that I realized that I wanted, and this is the process that I have to follow to get there. So for me, it was an easy decision to kind of drop everything else and roll with the competition side of doing Taekwondo.
Well, perhaps afterwards it seems like an easy decision, but at that moment it must have been a little bit hard. Can you walk us through a little bit about, okay, was there a point or an actual tipping point to say, like, if I went left, I go into this kind of elite gym where I commit myself to Taekwondo. If I went right, I'm probably just going to be a regular old kid, right? So,
Yeah.
can you walk us through that moment in your life?
Yeah. So kind of getting into it, like most martial arts gyms or clubs, 90% if not more are recreational, right? So a
Yeah.
lot of these kind of taekwondo karate schools, they're not meant for creating competitors. They're meant for working people through the curriculum and working them kind of up the belts. And that's where I found myself from ages 5 to 11ish. And I slowly decided, like, man, I loved sparring. I loved just that like that fighting, and we just never did it, right? So there were moments where I started to kind of lose the passion. I was like, man, I don't want to keep coming here and just going through the motions. Like, I want to spar, I want to fight, I want to compete. And there was just no support for that. I mean, my after begging and begging kind of the masters that were there to tell me, like, where's a tournament, right? They finally told me about a tournament. I went there with my family, and nobody was there, like, from that club. There, it was a huge tournament, and there were people from other clubs, but no one came to support. And my dad had to end up sitting in the coaching chair and, like, trying to tell me what to do. So, that was very much a pivotal moment of, how do I respond to that? Do I take kind of a negative situation like that where there wasn't any support and say, you know what, screw this, I don't want this anymore? Or do I go the other and say, you know what, if I could do this and still have fun despite having kind of no support, imagine how fun this gets when I have like a whole team around me. So that was a decision of, what do I do? Do I, I've been at this gym my whole life pretty much. Do I just wipe my hands of it and say, you know what, they can't provide me what I want, it's time for me to move on? Or do I say, this is time for me to kind of take it to the next level and take some risks here and try something new, but take the right step in terms of getting my kind of athletic career to the place that I want? So that was a situation where I could have gone one way or the other, and I decided to lean into, chasing that thing that I was passionate about, which was competing at a high level. And I'm glad that I made that decision.
Sounds good. So, but at that point, you're still fairly young. So you're probably what, like 12, 13 odd years old, or is it a little bit later when you made that decision?
Yeah, this was 2011 January, so I was 12.
Okay. And so at that point, like, you're committing yourself, and are you kind of that kid in school who basically misses a whole bunch of classes because you have tournaments and this and that to go to? Is that kind of what it ends up being over the next little while? And you have like notes for not completing assignments because you have to go across the country to compete in this and that? Or what was, or were you just, by day you were a regular kid and by night you were like Taekwondo man or
Yeah.
whatever superhero?
So I got lucky. I ended up going to a sports school in Markham called Bill Crothers.
Okay.
I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a school designed for athletes, pretty much. So it's a public school. It's free to get in, but you have to apply. So it's not like a feeder school for anybody. So you have to kind of
Right.
be accepted. And I'm grateful that I was there because it really helped with like the flexible schedule that I needed. So for example, I mean, through high school, like grade 9 to 12. I was missing like a significant amount of time to compete because Taekwondo is such a global international sport.
Yeah.
Every month or every 2 months we were in a different country competing. So, there was one year, I think it was maybe grade 12, where I think there's like 80 days in the semester or something, and I had 42 absences. So I missed like over 50% of like my final semester, and I was grateful to be in a school that kind of understood. I mean, not to the extent that I needed it to, but I did my best to kind of roll with that. So what I would have to do is I'd have to like, because I was also training 3 times a day, like we would train before school, after school, and at night. So I had no time to do work outside of that. So it forced me to be extremely disciplined and, get to school. And during lunchtime, I would eat my lunch really fast, go to the library, take care of some of the homework I had to do. We had kind of a period at the end of the day where we could do some homework, and a lot of people used it to just talk and relax. But I had to use that as the time because I didn't have any other time to do my work. So it forced me to kind of like adapt or die, right? Like either I can do this and I can be disciplined and make this work, or I can't and I'm kind of screwed. So it really forced me into being disciplined with my studies and taking care of my homework and setting myself up for a point where when I did have to leave to compete, I didn't have to worry about school or bringing textbooks with me because I did all the work behind the scenes to kind of keep it there. Whereas I had teammates that kind of brought their stuff with them, and that, that for me at least, it wouldn't have worked to kind of mix those two at the same time.
That's amazing. So it sounds like you were out of school, potentially out of the country, doing a whole bunch of different things on the Taekwondo level. And I'd love if you recall, like, what is the most kind of like, I guess, significant tournament or whatever that you had accomplished. So you're kind of growing up, kind of year by year, advancing up and up and up and up and up. What was there the kind of like first like realization? Hey, I can do this like full time or compete at an elite level. Did you have do you recall what that time was?
Yeah, so like I had said a couple times already, I mean, transitioning from a recreational gym to something more competitive, there were a lot of challenges along the way. Coming into a place where I just wasn't as skilled as all of my teammates because they've been doing this for a lot more time on a competitive scale than I had. So I had a lot of catching up to do. And we would go to local tournaments a lot. So, every month we were going to a local tournament kind of within Ontario. And I was always doing well. I just was never winning. I would come second or third. And we had a big kind of provincial games that was, in August. So I started there in January. Provincials were in August. And I was kind of thinking like, man, how am I gonna win this thing if I haven't even won a local game yet? And it was important because it was like a qualification for nationals. But long story short, I competed really well. I won provincials, and then I went to nationals. I won nationals, and then fast forward a couple years, there's a big tournament called the U.S. Open. It's one of the biggest kind of international events, and if you can win that, it's a pretty good indication that like you're good. You know what I mean? Like you're one of the best that there is because it's one of the best tournaments. And I was fortunate enough to win it back to back actually in 2014 and 2015. And I think that made me one of the first Canadians to win that tournament back to back.
Wow.
So at that moment for me, I was like, all right, like I know what I'm doing here. I'm ready to take this to the next level. I'm very much so on the right path, and if I keep doing what I'm doing, there's no reason why I can't get to what I want. And I would definitely say that turning point was, after winning the U.S. Open once and then winning it back to back and kind of defending that, being like, all right, like, I'm ready for this.
That's amazing. So, congratulations on the achievement, and very proud to have you on the show with that. But I'd love if you talk a little bit about kind of that journey after, because now you're at the pinnacle of your career. You can really become kind of that elite level athlete, but obviously that's not what you're doing necessarily now. Well, you're doing something similar, maybe even more important, but I'd love if you talk to us a little bit about the journey from kind of the height of like kind of winning the tournament back to back and where you are now.
Yeah, so it's a good point. I think it's an important story. So from there, I still had a few more years after that of competing at a high level and doing well. I mean, I was named captain of Team Canada for Taekwondo. I had gone out and earned a world ranking in the top 40 at a young age. So I was like maybe 17, 18 against grown men and being ranked in the top 40. In Canada and in this sport, I mean, Taekwondo is not a sport that has a lot that you can get from it kind of like long term. And what I mean by that, it's not a career, right? It's not basketball where when you make it to the NBA and you're set, or even MMA where like you can make the UFC and there's professional leagues. Taekwondo is an amateur sport. So what you find is there's a shelf life for a lot of kind of competitors, and where that takes them is pretty much about university, like grade 11, grade 12, where a lot of people back out because they have to prioritize their future, right? There's not really a future to competing in that sport. So when it comes to grade 11, grade 12, that's where a lot of people back out. For me, I kind of surpassed that shelf life a little bit, and I pushed through up until I was like 18, 19, I think 19. So, second year university type of thing. And again, I had to think like, okay, Olympics is 2 years away, right? Or 3 years away. So it's 2017, Tokyo 2020, or as it was supposed to be. And I had to think like, where am I now? Where do I want to go? And what is that going to take from me, right? So I'm like, okay, can I realistically qualify and do well at these Olympics? I genuinely believe that I could. The second part of the question was, at what cost, right? I'm going to have to drop out of school because there's no way I can do both in preparation. I'm going to have to not work. I can't work a job if I'm going to be training full time. I'm going to have to sacrifice time with family and relationships that are important to me to really kind of pursue this final stretch. And I thought about like, what's going to satisfy me coming home? Like, would I be satisfied with that? I go out there to Tokyo, I win a medal at the Olympics, and I come back and maybe, some pats on the back, maybe you do some you talk to a couple groups of people, but I realized like I'd be left with not a lot else, right? Like foundationally, especially like in this country where we kind of need a little bit more than that. This isn't a country where you just get paid like you won the lottery for winning the Olympics because that's what matters the most. Like sport is important in Canada, but it's not the most important by any means. So that was kind of a one of those forks in the road of what do I do? Do I keep doing what I've been doing my entire life and, commit to this final stretch, and I know I can get what I want, but at the risk of losing kind of a lot more? And I decided to go the other way, which is, what? I've had an amazing career. I've learned so much. I've developed as a person. I have no residual injuries or sorenesses or anything like that. I want to see if I can kind of repackage the skill set that made me successful as an athlete into something else. And I think it was leaning into that identity aspect that allowed me to make that decision. And it wasn't as hard. It wasn't as much of a, really tough one as much as it might have sounded, because I knew like, what made me successful as an athlete is going to make me successful in whatever else it is that I do. Let me repackage that and find what else that I want, instead of only labeling myself as an athlete and I'm only worth something based off of my results. I didn't want to be that person either.
Sounds awesome. So yeah, it must have been a tricky spot there, and obviously after the fact you can always speak to it a little bit better, but at the time it must have been pretty nerve-wracking on whether you made the right decision or not. Can you recall the time when maybe the first time that you realized that, oh, I'm no longer competing, right? I'm now doing this, and because you're still coaching folks in sports and athletics and stuff like that, but not as a competitor, as the coach behind the scenes. So can you walk us through a little bit about that, and maybe even before that, the journey to start MindLock? So I don't know which one came first, the MindLock or the egg, whichever one it is. Like how did that process start?
Yeah, I mean, it was tough. It was tough, and like I said, as much as I didn't struggle as much as a lot of people do, it doesn't mean I didn't struggle with it, right? I mean, it took me a long time to learn, instead of saying I do Taekwondo, to say I used to do, right? Like that was tough because, since I was 5, I've been doing this my entire life, and it's always been so ingrained with my identity. And, I'm Dylan, the Taekwondo fighter, the international competitor, the team captain. So, it took a while. Like, it took probably, if I'm being realistic, like up to at least a year, maybe 6 months to a year, to kind of transition out of I do this to I used to do this, or I did this. But in terms of like starting MindLock and where that came, I mean, I've always had the idea for it, especially it's what made me successful as a competitor, was leaning into the mental side of competing, because I was never the tallest or the fastest or the most naturally gifted, in my division. I had to rely on other things. I had to rely on my toughness. I had to rely on my discipline. I had to rely on the game planning and the mental kind of analytics of competing. And it's what made me so successful. And traveling and to all these different parts of the world and seeing these national teams, you notice things, and you notice, okay, all these teams have physiotherapists. They all have dietitians. They all have massage therapists. And it always shocked me that no one had like mental coaches, especially like how significant the mental game is. So I knew for a long time, like, that's what I was going to do. I didn't necessarily know that it was going to be right away, but I always had the idea of like, what, when I'm done, I definitely want to go into, the mental coaching side of things. I didn't really have a timeline for it, but I knew, I mean, if you go back to my 8th grade yearbook, when it says, what do you want to be in 20 years? And everybody says doctor, lawyer, police officer, whatever. Mine said sports psychologist at like, in 8th grade. So I've always known that this was what I wanted to do, kind of combining the mental side with the athletic side and merging those two things together. And, it happened a lot sooner than I guess I anticipated it to, but it was pretty much like a right away. Like if I stopped competing end of 2017, and by February 2018 we were launched and ready to go, so it was a pretty quick turnaround.
That's amazing. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about, like, did it turn out exactly as you'd hope, as you planned when you were in kind of grade 8? that being the sports psychologist, did it meet your expectations, or was it different? So what was that process like?
It surpassed my expectations, honestly. And I mean, I'm just getting started, so I'm obviously excited to see how it progresses from there. But I also didn't really have any expectations, right? I've always kind of been the person where it's like, I'm just going to roll with it. I'm going to try something, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to see, right? I try not to overthink things to the point of it being kind of crippling and kind of preventing me from taking action. I've always been, let me just do it. Let me just roll with it and see how it goes, right? Let me kind of like start first and kind of learn as I'm going. So I didn't really have like clear set expectations as to what I wanted from it, especially at a younger age. But I knew that I wanted to be working with athletes or working with teams in a capacity where people would kind of come see me. And I guess I always had more of a traditional vision, back in the day of like having an office and people coming in. And it's definitely progressed to be more modern based in terms of like global reach and doing things online and having access, whether it's one-to-one or it's online programming and reaching people in different parts of the world. Like it's taken a much more modern twist as time's gone on, but it still honors, what I've always wanted it to be, which is, supporting the next generation of athletes achieve their goals through the mental side of training that was so impactful for me.
Sounds good. So presumably you took what you learned in kind of the sports psychology domain and kind of made it your own, because obviously you have some lived experience having gone through it, and then you kind of say, okay, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, and this is what it says in the textbook, and let me kind of piece together all the different things. And obviously you're sharing that with your clients and helping them through that. And if you were to share some from a high level, like some of the things that you would do from a sports psychology perspective for those like budding athletes who want to get a little bit better in the mental game, could you share like a couple of tips or tricks for folks that are looking to get a little bit better in their mental game?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing that I always recommend, for athletes is to get a hold of like a training journal and to throw that in your bag and document after every practice. Training is a thing that we do so often and so repetitively, but there's so much value there, right? Like it's the place where you develop and you learn and you face challenges and obstacles and you overcome them. And to just kind of like, leave it where it is I think a disservice, right? This, because it's so valuable, if we can track that and document that, I think it's huge. So I always advise athletes, get a notebook, throw it in your bag, and when training's done, write down a few things. Write down, number one, what did you do? Number two, how did it feel? And then the third one is how can it, kind of lead to a goal for next practice, right? So you could say, what was the structure of the training? How did it feel? What were things that went really well? What were things that frustrated you and challenged you? And based off of that, how can you use that to set a better goal for next time? And it just allows you to document your progress, to build that self-awareness. And, it honors one of my favorite quotes, which is, you have to collect the dots to connect the dots, right? You have to gather information first in order to be able to take a step back and see what those trends are. But if we're never keeping track of any of that stuff, it just gets kind of washed away. So the ability to gather that data, collect that intel, document your progress, it's something that you can do right away. You can do it today to start. Go to the dollar store, pick up a notebook, pick up a pen, throw it in your bag and get started. And it's one of the most impactful things you can do that doesn't require a lot of kind of investment, time or money.
Sounds good. It reminds me of a slightly different quote. I think it comes from Socrates, where it's like an unexamined life is not worth living, where you need to collect the dots, you need to examine the dots and take a look at the dots and then connect them. Otherwise, then it's just like you're going through the motions and it's not as helpful. So I'm sure that you'll have a lot more kind of advice, but I'd love if you shared some of the swike that you'd have with Dylan, I guess young Dylan, as he kind of progressed through his career, his life, at any kind of pivotal points. What are maybe 2 or 3 pieces of swike that you'd share with yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's an important question. The first one I would say is to be persistent, but to also know when to move on, right? I've always had that persistence, and I think it's helped me a lot of the time. I mean, even if it's just reaching out to someone or, sending a DM, maybe they don't answer right away. Maybe you try again, and, maybe the third or fourth time is when it works. Like, oh, hey, yeah, sorry about that. I was busy. Like, okay, what's going on? So be persistent and don't give up early, but at the same time, don't beat a dead horse. Like, if you know it's not going to work, I've definitely been guilty of, like, trying, like, to really force something to happen that's just not there. And at the end of the day, you don't really want that. Like, whether it's a client or whether it's a deal or whether it's something else, like, anything that you really have to kind of drag along the way, it's not going to be really fruitful anyway. So trying to balance, like, be persistent and don't give up prematurely. But when you kind of recognize that it's just not there for you in the way that you think it is, save the energy, move on, because the next opportunity is waiting. You don't want to get too caught up in trying to force something that's not there, right? So that's one. Number two is I would definitely say to prioritize organization at, like, a structural level early on. It's easy to build bad habits when you don't need them to be great, right? So, like, you don't need a system necessarily when you only have, like, one or two clients. You're only working for a few hours a week. You don't need a system. You can get away with kind of doing it a little bit easier. But when you start to scale and things grow, you never want to be in a position where, you're almost outscaling your own structure and organization. So you want to make sure that you're definitely organized enough when you don't need to be, so that when you need to be, it's there, right? You don't want to kind of work backwards and, like, oh my God, I'm busy now. Now I have to kind of come up with a system to manage this. Like, manage it first, figure out a structure that works, figure out a system that you're comfortable with, and then you can start to support some of that weight of scaling. But it's hard to do both of those things at the same time. So think about structure and foundation first to support the scale instead of doing it the other way around. And then the last one is actually interesting, because I'm at a point, obviously, in my life and my career where I feel like at times I've lived two lives. Like, I've lived an entire life as an athlete, and I've learned all these lessons as an athlete, and now I'm almost resetting in business, in entrepreneurship, and it's kind of like a new chapter. And one of the things that, I guess I wish I knew earlier, but I was also very mindful of applying now, was enjoying the small wins and letting myself be comfortable with that. As an athlete, I never did that. I never took time and patted myself on the back, because there's always the next thing, right? Even going back to what I was saying before with the US Open and stuff, I never even took a second to be like, yeah, that was really cool. Never. It was always, what's next? There's this mentality of, like, if I take time and reflect, I'm, like, losing my momentum and I'm slowing myself down. It's not the case, right? So I was able to accomplish a lot without giving myself kind of the credit and taking some time and being proud of myself and appreciating those small wins. And it's something that I kind of regretted at the end of, like, I probably could have celebrated a little bit more as it went on, and it would have been enjoyable. So as I transitioned into entrepreneurship and business, that was a goal I had set for myself, which is I want to do that now. I want to appreciate the small wins. I want to kind of celebrate the small stuff a little bit more, because I'll get there. Like, when it comes to being successful, it's the same thing. I've always had this belief of being successful in whichever thing that I do, but it doesn't mean that you have to be miserable the entire way. It's not going to be glamorous. It's not going to be fun the whole time. It's not as cool as it looks on social media, but at the same time, the same way that I, achieved the goals that I wanted in sport and could have kind of enjoyed the process a little bit more, I knew that, like, I'm going to achieve the things that I want in entrepreneurship and business. Let me enjoy the ride along the way. And it was actually something that, because I had kind of learned from myself in my athletic career, I was able to apply it further. So it's kind of something that I wish that I knew earlier and had an opportunity to apply. So it's kind of a cool metric there.
That's amazing. Lots to unpack in those statements. So if I go reverse order, kind of like enjoying the small wins, I think that's definitely important. It reminds me of that quote, life's about the journey, not the destination, and take time to smell the roses, that sort of thing, because it is super important to do that, and it just makes things a little bit more enjoyable and a little more sustainable too, right? Because if you're always looking for the next thing, it's kind of hard to keep going and going and going. On the organization and structure, I'm reminded of the expression, discipline equals freedom, right? For a lot of people, when they do things like ad hoc, they spend extra time doing it. Whereas if you put a structure and put some discipline ahead of time, then you have a lot more time to do the important stuff that you can figure out later on. And then the first one about being kind of persistent and knowing when to move on. It's like, don't sell the unsellable, where there are a whole bunch of people where like they won't buy, right? So why bother? But at the same time, they won't buy yet, or not now. So it is that kind of fine line to figure out, am I beating a dead horse, or is it just one more email and then I'll lock them? So I think a lot of that is great advice. And you're still young and early in the journey. And I'm looking forward to following you along and seeing how you grow into all these other different areas, and learning more Siwike from you in the future. But I'd love if you shared kind of where folks can connect with you and contact you, and then maybe a couple of future aspirations along the way.
Yeah, for sure. So, we're a lot of everything's on Instagram. So either my personal one, which is, at Dylan Nadler with an underscore, or the MindLock one, which is at MindLock with an underscore at the end. We do a lot on Instagram, and it's a great place to kind of check out what we do, see who we work with, see some highlights. Like, it's a pretty cool, almost portfolio of showcasing what we do at MindLock. So that's on the Instagram page. I've been trying to get more active on LinkedIn, just on my personal page of Dylan Nadler, trying to get, posting some more longer form posts and getting into articles and blogs and stuff like that, kind of double clicking into more kind of specific concepts which are important. And then there's another way, if you're kind of interested in the actual content of what we do. We also have a fully kind of online course which gives you access to all of the curriculum that we offer at MindLock. So all of the video lessons, the activities, the worksheets, the assessments, case studies for professionals. So if you go to courses.mindlock.ca, it's a great place to check that out. And in terms of kind of what's next, for me, it's kind of leaning into that, what I just talked about with the course. Adding a product to a service was something that was always important to me, because that's kind of how you scale. In a service-based business, you're limited by your time, you're limited by kind of all of those things, and being able to scale with this type of thing was really important to me, to put a lot of time and do it right. Not just do it to do it, but do it in the right way. So taking all of that structure and that curriculum and all that knowledge and bundling it into a fully kind of online course that people can go and access whenever they want at, like I said, at courses.mindlock.ca. It was always important to do it the right way, and now that it's launched and it's good to go, it's cool to see people going through it and their reviews and having a chance to kind of take their learning into their own hands. So that's what I'm excited about, is kind of building that out and scaling it, and seeing in which other ways we can support people around the world.
That's amazing, Dylan. So we'll definitely include all of those in the show notes here, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up with you on kind of the new advancements, how you scale your service and your products and all that sort of stuff, and see what else is new in the land of Dylan. So thanks so much, Dylan, for sharing your Siwike and your insights, and hopefully we'll have you back for a future episode.
Of course, yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It was awesome.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us on the Siwike Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Lukidanu, Lukidanu, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.